All right, I know I might be stepping into a minefield with this, but let's talk about CRT.
Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz.
All right, I want to get into this with potentially a couple videos. In this video, I really just want to talk about some of the origins of CRT and some themes from CRT. But before I get into that, a really quick personal note. I've been reading stuff from the CRT field for several years now. In fact, I was reading CRT books before I even knew the term critical race theory. I was reading it certainly before it was a culture war kind of lightning rod. So I was just absorbing information and trying to learn from these scholars, and have been for a while. And also, I am not. This is a hard needle to thread. I'm trying to be all about nuance and complication on this channel. And so as I get into this conversation, I realize there are people who might click this video and are simply wanting ammunition to undermine CRT, or there might be people who click this video for the exact opposite reason. I'm not really trying to do either of those things. Here's what I have in mind. There are people in my personal life and even people online who have asked me just about critical race theory, and I get the sense that there are a lot of people out there who see this as just a major lightning rod, but also get the sense that the people who use these terms, that you know how you get that feeling when someone uses a culture-loaded term and you just get the sense of like, I'm not sure you actually know what you're talking about when you say this, when you talk about CRT in this case. I get the feeling there's a lot of people out there who want to know about CRT, who are interested and maybe a little confused or curious about the controversy around it, but don't know where to start, don't know what voices to trust, but still want to know more about what actually is this thing that everyone seems so upset about. Those are the people I have in mind when I'm making this video. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. I'm really not trying to dial up culture war issues on this at all, and quite the opposite. I actually want to take the temperature down, because I think there's a lot of helpful stuff in CRT to learn from. I also don't think that CRT is above critique. I think good CRT scholars would say that CRT is not above critique, just like any academic field. So anyways, that's where I'm coming at this. Hopefully that's a helpful angle for you. If you're watching this and you're just looking for, I don't know, polemics, culture war ammo, I'm not going to give it, I don't think. But if you want to know more, if you want to have like better conversations about this and know exactly, hopefully a little bit more about this thing that so many people are so amped up about, hopefully this will be helpful to you. Okay. It's enough of a preamble, of an intro. I'm trying to step carefully, as you can tell. Nevertheless, I think this is an important thing to talk about. So what I want to do in this video, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the origins of CRT, because I think that helps kind of wrap your mind around what it is, where it came from, and why. So I'm going to talk about those two things. When did it show up? Some thoughts about why it showed up when it did. A couple themes that are at the origins of CRT that inform where it's gone since. And then point to a couple resources, point beyond me to some other resources that I think are good intro level resources for people who want to know more. Okay, so let's get into it. So critical race theory emerged not that long ago. It's only a handful of decades old. It came about in the mid 80s-ish, late 80s into the early 90s is when it started to form, when scholars started to come together under this umbrella as critical race scholars. So it's not that long ago. It's just in the 80s. I mean, I was born in the 80s. So, basically the time of my life is when CRT has been around. Particularly, and there's one scholar in particular who is kind of, I think it's fair to say, is kind of the pioneer forefather scholar of CRT, which is Derek Bell, a man named Derek Bell, who was at Harvard, a law scholar. I'll talk more about law in a minute. But he was one who started to publish some books like And We Are Not Saved, or Faces at the Bottom of the Well, which started to open up this conversation, and other scholars started to join the conversations he was having, and then this field of CRTs kind of got born out of that. And I believe the first time the term was used was at a convention in the late 80s when we were trying to get law scholars together to discuss some of the questions that people like Derek Bell were bringing up. Now, it emerged, I mentioned law a few times. This is super important to know. Critical race theory emerged out of critical law studies, and people like Derek Bell, and then also Kimberly Crenshaw, who is another kind of pioneering important figure. They're law scholars, really serious law scholars. And so critical legal studies is a broad field that took a critical eye at law. and would look back over things like Supreme Court cases, policy changes, and just ask hard critical questions of how these legal shifts might be informing cultural shifts or might be impacting culture more broadly. That was critical legal studies in general, to way oversimplify it. Critical race theory then took that broad approach towards law, the critical approach towards law, but specifically circumscribed their questions around the question of race, racism, disparities, prejudice, that kind of thing. All along racial lines. So someone like Derek Bell was very, very concerned with those questions, and of course Kimberly Crenshaw and others after, Richard Delgado and others. There's a lot more now. So that's when it emerged, late 80s, early 90s, and it emerged out of critical legal studies before it took on the what it's known as now. And it took law questions, but directed them towards questions of race and justice. Now, some thoughts on why. So that's when. Why it emerged? This is, of course, a complicated conversation. I'm going to give a few thoughts that I find pretty compelling and persuasive as to why it emerged when it did. Because I think this also really helps us wrap our mind around what CRT is about. So, think about this. CRT emerges 25, 30 years after, arguably, some of the biggest legal gains in racial justice in America. Namely, Brown versus Board of Education in the 50s, which of course famously desegregated schools, or at least was, as Derek Bell would say, that was the intent of it. Or whether or not it actually did, that's a whole other conversation. But regardless, Brown versus Board of Education, it's pretty universally recognized as an extremely important watershed Supreme Court case in the mid-50s. And then in the mid-60s, of course, you have what? The Civil Rights Movement, and then the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act in the mid-60s. So major, and again, the law thing is really important here. These are major legal shifts over those 2 decades, 50s and 60s, legal shifts. And so flash forward 30 years after that, and then take legal scholars like a Derek Bell, who are looking at society and raising really critical questions like, why are there still, if we achieved such a landmark legal victory a generation ago, basically, why are there still so many racial disparities in things like incarceration rates, health, crime, wealth and income, housing, de facto segregation in cities, that kind of stuff? Why, along all of these things that are measurable and quantifiable, why are there massive racial gaps a full generation after all these supposed huge racial justice victories in the courts, in the law, in the policies? So again, I keep hammering this because laws and policies shifted, and then legal scholars a couple decades after that were taking a critical legal eye at them and asking really hard questions about what's going on in our society. And so the driving question was basically, and this is oversimplifying it a little bit, but I think it's fair to say that a driving question was, after the Civil Rights Movement, why are there still so many racial disparities? And therefore, is it then fair to say that those were actually victories or not? Right? So in a real way, you can say that people like Derek Bell and others experienced a pretty profound disillusionment with this notion that we won legal victories in the 50s and 60s. And we're pretty disillusioned with the cultural narrative that we had kind of conquered racism in the courts in those landmark decisions, right? And so he would take his critical legal eye to look at what's going on today and kind of look back over history and try to bring out things that maybe are popularly misunderstood or maybe just popularly ignored. So that's a little bit about when it emerged and I think why. I think it's fair to say those are some factors at least that contributed to why this field emerged and why these scholars started to ask these questions when they asked them in the ways that they were asking them. So now, again, I'm trying to keep these videos succinct and simple as possible. So there's so many other things I would love to say. And there's probably people who are like, well, you should talk about this, or you should talk about this, you should talk about this. I'm going to leave that there for now, just as a note on its origin. What I want to comment now are on a few themes that come out of this, especially in its origins in the 90s especially. So coming out of these questions and kind of rigorously, critically looking back at the legacy of the Civil Rights Movement and Brown v. Board and stuff, Derek Bell has a lot of controversial things to say about the Brown versus Board of Education. It's really interesting. So here's a few themes that start to emerge broadly under the critical race theory umbrella. One is this idea of impact over intent. One is obviously unintended consequences. of legal shifts. And then the third one, and this is pretty huge, is the notion of what I'm calling invisible racism. So impact over intent, unintended consequences, and then invisible racism. And I'm just going to comment briefly on some of these things without going too deeply into it, and then recommend a few resources, and then potentially tee up some other deeper dive conversations in maybe some future videos. So the impact over intent concept is pretty simple. It's just saying basically that, especially when you look at law, the impact of the legal change is what matters. You can set aside the intent. So Derek Bell might say something like the impact of Brown versus Board in terms of desegregation and what it did is way more important to evaluate than the intent of the lawmakers. If the intent of the lawmakers was a truly anti-racist intent, but the impact of the law actually propagated racist disparities in our society, then it doesn't matter what the intent was, we had to look at the impact. And this impact over intent language and perspective is, well, it's all over the anti-racist kind of material that comes out of, broadly speaking, you can say comes out of CRT or is influenced by CRT today, 30, 40 years later. So yeah, impact over intent. Look at someone like an Ibram Kendi today, who writes in his How to Be Anti-Racist book that we need to have policy evaluation that really only looks at the outcomes. And if there are, he would say, and I've heard him say, if there are any racially disparate outcomes, that means it's a racist policy. So that's that impact over intent idea, right? And I have to say, as a way, I'm not going to comment on Kendi. Let's park that for a second. But in terms of Derek Bell's work, especially, I think that that's a really valid way to at least ask questions about law, especially when you're talking about laws and social structures and policies. I think it's fair to at least park the intent question aside and say we got to look carefully at the impact. Now, huge questions come up when you start to say, well, okay, well, what's the cause? Right? What's the cause of the disparities? What's really going on there? That's where things get really complicated, and that's where especially some CRT conclusions get really controversial. But I just want to say, particularly for those who are very, very skeptical right now of CRT, a lot of these questions, especially in their early forms in the 90s, they were very, very valid ways to try to figure out what's going on socially. So impact over intent, really, really big theme, and you can see that all over the work, people like Ibram Kendi and others today. Unintended consequences is a very similar idea. Someone like Michelle Alexander, whose book, The New Jim Crow, I have up on my shelf. It's a really, really important book. But she talks very, very well about the consequences of policies about the war on drugs, for example, and how the consequences of those, regardless, again, of intent, the consequences are super important to evaluate along racial lines. And then again, that critical race theory lens of race wants to see how do these things impact people along racial lines, because they're trying to understand the impact of the legacy of racial policies, things like Jim Crow, etc. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about that. But unintended consequences is a very, very big theme that continues to go. And then finally, the third theme I want to talk about is invisible racism. And these things all feed together. So impact over intent and unintended consequences feed into this idea of what you can say is invisible racism, or you may have heard the phrase racism without racists. This is also the foundation upon which will be built the idea of systemic racism, which is systems that propagate racialization and racist outcomes, regardless of whether any individuals in them are racistly motivated themselves. This is where the stuff starts to build together and starts to produce some of these concepts, right? But invisible racism or racism without racists, or policies that have racist outcomes, even if they don't have racist language in them, these are things that critical race scholars would start to really try to dive into and unpack. And the idea, you can almost sense the idea. So I'm actually currently reading Derek Bell's book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. I might do a review of it on this channel, but there's a lot of this language in his work too. But you get this sense with critical race scholars, especially at the beginning of the field, you get this sense that they were very, very skeptical of dismantling racist laws, they were very skeptical of the effort to dismantle racist laws and then say that we won a victory, because some of the mentality would basically be that, maybe you removed racist language from laws, or maybe you legally encoded some things to counteract racism, but then racism almost just gets submerged. It becomes invisible. It has kind of a permutation and takes on a different form and continues to impact and have these racialized outcomes in our society, even though you can't point to anything specific in the law that is responsible. this is invisible racism. It kind of gets under the surface. Almost, you can almost sense this like subconscious Freudian idea to it, that it's like racism gets it's encoded and embedded in laws, and then as the laws get dismantled, the racism doesn't disappear, but just gets kind of embedded deeper into the psyche of the society. That's kind of the critical, I mean, I'm simplifying stuff. I'm cringing almost as I'm saying this because I know I'm simplifying it too much, but that's kind of a fair way, I think, to say that CRT scholars approach looking at this. And if it's true that racism gets kind of submerged and more deeply embedded, then the work of CRT scholars is to re-expose it, to bring it back out, right? To bring it back to the surface so it can be dealt with. And actually, some of Derek Bell's writing is actually very, I would say, courageous in that sense. It's like, we need to not despair. He would say, we need to not despair about this, even if racism is deeply embedded, more so than we expected. We need to expose it, right? And so if racism is indeed invisible and has been pushed down, then trying to emerge it back out. And then you can connect a line from that to people like Robin DiAngelo, whose book White Fragility and all of her talks about whiteness and how white people are born into something that they didn't ask for or earn or even try. White people may not be trying to be racist, but they've been born into something that's racist, and they are kind of absorbing it through the atmosphere. I mean, that's this invisible racism idea, right? Which has been kind of defined and explained by early forms of CRT, right? So you can see its impact. I think. Now, I do not like I don't like dismissing anyone like a Robin DiAngelo. I'm not trying to do any of that. I'm just trying to draw these connecting themes and connecting threads to especially the early forms of CRT. So those are some themes. And again, there's way more you can talk about, but impact over intent, unintended consequences of the law, legal changes, and then invisible racism that takes on new forms in society. These are really, really important concepts in the field of CRT. And I will have to say, I just want to end, again, I want to reiterate, I think especially with people like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, especially at the time and when these things started to emerge, I have to say that I think it's a perfectly valid pursuit to say, particularly when you're someone like a Derek Bell who's in 20, 30 years after civil rights and the things that he's seen and the things he studied. He's a brilliant legal mind. The things that he studied and the things he saw, to ask the question, like, is it possible we overstated the case that we conquered racism in the civil rights era? Is that possible? And is there something we're missing? Is there something we need to revise in our understanding of our history? That's a really valid question. I think it's an important question, and one that should not be dismissed or invalidated. But CRT, if it started then, it's been around for several decades now, and it has gone through a lot of changes. It's mutated and it's taken on different forms. It's moved out of squarely the legal critique, and it's moved definitely into critiquing media and popular culture and psychology and the news and all that stuff. It's really proliferated into lots of different forms and changed quite a bit, actually, and also importantly gotten moved down to a bit of a more popular level in kind of recent years. And all these things are really important changes to try to take account of, and they're things I might try to tackle in future videos. And I do also think there are a lot of lazy critiques of CRT going on right now. Really, really lazy critiques. There's good faith critiques that I think are important to listen to, and there's lazy ones that I think are not helpful in the conversation. And I might try to cover some of those in future videos if that would be helpful. But what I want to do, I want to end here. I've talked long enough. This got longer than I meant. I want to end by pointing to some resources, particularly primary resources, because I think that'd be really helpful. Again, these are for people who just want to, I'm not fully throated endorsing all of these resources per se, but I am endorsing them in the sense that I think they're really helpful as a way to understand CRT better. I'm endorsing them as a way to, if you want to learn CRT and what it's about, read this stuff. It's helpful. I hate that I have to even give that qualifier, but that's where I'm coming at this from. This is such a charged topic. But one is simple enough. It's the book Critical Race Theory, an Introduction, by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik, I think is how you say that. It's a really short book. This is the third edition of it. Very easy to read. It's a good book. They give discussion questions after each chapter. They do a really admirable job at summarizing lots of concepts. It's a hard field to wrap your mind around because, again, it's proliferated out and splintered out into so many different directions, but they do a good job of it in this book, so I'd recommend that. Secondly is an essay by Kimberly Crenshaw called MLK or Martin Luther King Encounters Post-Racialism. I think you can find this online. I found a PDF of it. Martin Luther King Encounters Post-Racialism. It's a great, super readable essay. It's really, really good at getting at some of the themes. Again, that disillusionment with civil rights and asking the question of, did the civil rights movement accomplish what we intended it to? Great, it's a good essay for that. If you're a Christian, there is a scholar at Wheaton named, I think you say Nathan Cartagena, I think is how you say that, right? He has a great 3-part series of articles in Faithfully magazine called what Christians get wrong about critical race theory. So if you're a Christian, that might be a really good resource for you. It's very readable, and he really knows CRT well. And then last one is a podcast. For if you're not really much of a reader or don't feel like you have time for reading, there's a great podcast series called Seeing White, and it's a podcast called Seen on Radio. I might put the logo up here, but SCENE on Radio. Seeing White, several years old now, but it's really good. It's very, very well produced, well researched, and it's very good at approaching the themes of critical race theory. So those are some resources that hopefully you find helpful. Yeah, this is an important topic. It's one I'm going to get into. I would be willing to get into more. So if you have other questions about this, other books you maybe would recommend, post them below. Post your thoughts, post your questions, if there's anything you'd like to do a deeper dive on or would love to hear me give some of my thoughts on, I'd be happy to do that. I really want to help us depolarize our conversations around this topic and actually have more positive engagement. So thanks again for watching. I hope that you found this helpful or at minimum, thought-provoking.